This is about my father, the man who taught me how to change a tire in a Canadian Tire parking lot on a January morning so cold our breath came out in clouds. The man who made pancakes every Saturday without fail for 37 years, even when my mother was in the hospital and it was just the two of us sitting at that kitchen table in silence. I want to be clear about something before I say anything else. I loved my wife. I genuinely did. For 22 years I loved her, and I thought she loved us back, all of us, including my father. I was wrong. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I'm 64 years old. I live in Brampton, Ontario, and 8 months ago, I discovered that the woman I had built my entire adult life with was doing something to my father that I still can't say out loud without my hands going cold. My father is 81. His name is Roy. He was a carpenter for 40 years. The kind of man whose hands were always rough, and whose laugh was always loud, and who never in his life asked anyone for anything he couldn't earn himself. When my mother passed in 2019, he stayed in their house in Barrie for about a year and a half before I started noticing things. A bill he'd forgotten to pay. A grocery run he'd skipped for 2 weeks because he couldn't find his keys. Nothing alarming on its own. But I know my father. I know the difference between a man who's slowing down and a man who's starting to disappear. And he was starting to disappear. My wife, I'll call her my wife throughout this, because that's what she was to me for 22 years, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. She was the one who suggested he move in with us. I remember being surprised. They had a complicated history, the way most fathers-in-law and daughters-in-law do. Cordial at holidays, polite over dinners, never warm, exactly, but not cold either. So when she brought it up over supper one evening in the spring of 2023, I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't even realized was tight. He shouldn't be up there alone, she said. We have the room. We did have the room. After our son moved to Vancouver for work, the upstairs had gone quiet in a way that echoed. And my father, when I called him that night and asked if he'd consider it, went quiet for a long moment before he said, "If it's not too much trouble." That was my father in a sentence. If it's not too much trouble. He moved in the first week of June. My wife organized his room herself, new curtains, a proper reading lamp, a small television on the dresser. She was attentive at first, cooked things she knew he liked, asked about his woodworking. I watched all of this with something that felt a lot like gratitude. The first thing I noticed was so small I barely registered it. It was maybe 6 weeks after he moved in. I'd come home from work. I do project management for a mid-sized construction firm, so the hours can go long, and my father was sitting alone in his room watching the news with the volume turned very low. He smiled when he saw me, but there was something behind it, a flatness, the way someone smiles when they've been told to keep a certain expression and they're following instructions. I asked if he was hungry. He said he'd already eaten. I went downstairs and found my wife watching something on her laptop. She said dinner was in the oven, keeping warm. I served myself, didn't think much of it, and the evening went on. But I started paying attention. Not because anything dramatic happened. It was more like a weather system moving in from the west. You don't see the rain, but the air changes, the light changes, and something in you knows before you can say why. My father started answering questions in shorter and shorter sentences. He'd always been a talker, the kind of man who could turn a trip to Canadian Tire into a 20-minute story about the time he helped his own father roof a barn in Muskoka. That started disappearing. Meals happened more often with him eating separately. I'd find his plate in the microwave, wrapped in cellophane, the food dry around the edges. When I asked why he hadn't eaten with us, he'd say he wasn't that hungry, that he'd eaten earlier, that he didn't want to be a bother. One evening in August, I came home and found him in the backyard sitting in one of the plastic chairs near the fence. It was getting cool out. He had a cardigan on, but it wasn't enough. He looked like he'd been there for a while. I went out and sat with him. "You should come inside," I said. "It's getting cold." "In a minute," he said. We sat there for a bit. The neighbor's dog was barking somewhere down the alley. The sun was already low. "Son," he said. "He's called me son my whole life, even when I was taller than him. Does your wife find it difficult, having me here?" I turned to look at him. "What do you mean?" I said. He shook his head. "Nothing. Never mind. I'm being foolish." "No," I said. "Tell me." He looked at the fence. "She's under a lot of stress. I understand that. People have their limits. I don't want to be a burden." I told him he wasn't a burden. He nodded, the way someone nods when they're accepting something they don't believe. We went inside. I told myself he was adjusting, that moving in with family at 81 is a disruption regardless of how welcome you are, that the flatness I was seeing was grief, still carrying my mother, still grieving the house in Barrie, the woodshop he'd had to leave behind. I told myself a lot of things. Then, the second week of September, I found the bruise. He came down to breakfast in a long-sleeved shirt, which wasn't unusual. My father runs cold, always has. But when he reached across the table to get the milk, the sleeve rode up and I saw it. On his forearm, dark, the size of a loonie, maybe a bit bigger, yellowish at the edges, which meant it was a few days old at least. "Dad," I said, "what happened to your arm?" He pulled the sleeve down. "Caught it on the doorframe," he said. "I'm clumsy in the night. I let it go, I don't know why. Part of me thinks I was scared of what it would mean if I didn't let it go. But I couldn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark beside my wife, listening to the house, and I thought about the flatness in his eyes, and the way he'd ask me whether his presence was difficult for her, and the bruise on his forearm that was days old and that he hadn't mentioned to me. I thought about the dry plate in the microwave. I thought about how loud his laugh used to be. I thought about my mother, who had trusted me to take care of him. The next morning I drove to a Best Buy in Mississauga and bought a small security camera. I told myself it was just to set my mind at ease. I told myself I would see nothing, that I would feel embarrassed, that I would take it down in a week and we'd never speak of it. I set it up in his room that afternoon while he was napping, positioned on the bookshelf behind some books, angled to see the door and the bed. It was motion activated. It would upload to my phone. I need to explain what the first night showed me, because this is the part that changed everything, not just what I found out, but the fact that I had not known, that I had been sleeping 8 feet down the hall. The footage from the first night was time-stamped 11:47 p.m. My wife opened his door without knocking. My father was already awake. He must have heard her coming. She came in and stood at the foot of his bed and she spoke in a low voice, low enough that the camera didn't catch all of it clearly. But I could read enough. I could see his face. He was pressed back against the headboard. Not the posture of a man receiving a goodnight check. The posture of a man trying to make himself smaller. She was gesturing at him, pointing. At one point she leaned down and I saw her take something from the nightstand, his phone, the old Samsung used to call me and my son, and she put it in her dressing gown pocket. Then she left. I sat in my car on my lunch break watching this on my phone, and I had to stop twice and just breathe. I didn't go back into the office. I drove around for an hour, and then I went home early, and I sat at the kitchen table while my father was napping, and I thought about what to do. I needed to understand the full shape of what was happening. I needed to know how long, and how much, and whether I was seeing the worst of it or just a corner of it. I went through the joint account statements. We had separate accounts for personal spending, but all the household expenses ran through a joint account. Groceries, utilities, insurance. I also knew my father had agreed to contribute a small amount monthly toward the household, money he received from his CPP and OAS, just over $2,000 a month in total, between his Canada pension and his old age security. He'd insisted on it, said he didn't want to live for free. What I found when I looked at the statements was a second account I didn't recognize. Transfers. Small ones at first, 200 here, 300 there, and then larger ones, going back 11 months. Before he'd even moved in with us, she had been planning it. She had suggested he move in because she had been planning it. I want to say that at this point, I confronted her immediately. I want to tell you I did what anyone watching this would expect a decent man to do. But the truth is, I sat on that information for 4 days, because I needed to understand what my father actually knew, and what he was afraid to tell me, and because I needed to talk to someone who could tell me what I was actually dealing with. I called an elder abuse helpline. In Ontario, it's connected to the Seniors Safety Line, 1-866-299-111, and I'm saying that number out loud because I didn't know it existed, and I think more people should. And I spoke to someone there for almost an hour. She helped me understand that what I was describing had a name. Financial exploitation of a vulnerable elder, emotional abuse, possibly physical, given the bruising. She told me what to document and what to do next. During those 4 days, I also sat with my father, not dramatically, not with a list of questions, I just started being home more. I made the breakfasts. I drove him to his Thursday appointment with his GP in Brampton. And one afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table over tea, I asked him quietly, just the two of us, whether he was happy here. He looked out the window for a long time. "I miss Barry," he said. "I know. I miss the shop." He meant his woodworking shop, the little cedar-smelling space behind the house in Barry that we'd had to clear out when he left. He'd made furniture in there for 50 years. A dining table that my son uses in Vancouver now. A jewelry box he made my mother for their 25th anniversary that she kept on her dresser until the day she died. "Dad's," I said. Has anything ever happened that scared you?" He looked at me then. A long, careful look. The look of a man deciding whether or not to put something down that he has been carrying alone. "I didn't want to cause trouble," he said. Those words broke something in me that I don't think is entirely fixed yet. He told me some of it, not all of it. I don't think he remembers all of it, or perhaps he's chosen not to hold all of it, but enough. The nighttime visits that started weeks in, after she'd gotten access to his banking information to help him set up automatic payments. The taking of his phone so he couldn't call my son in Vancouver without her knowing. The way she'd tell him what he was allowed to say if I asked him directly about something. She had a phrase she used. "Don't make things harder than they are, Roy." The time she'd come in at night and go through his wallet. The bruise, he said he'd tripped, but when he said it, he didn't look at me. I went to a lawyer the following Monday. A family lawyer in Mississauga, who also handles elder law matters. I told her everything. I showed her the camera footage, the bank statements, the transfers. She told me what steps to take and in what order. I came home that evening. My wife was in the kitchen. My father was in his room. I stood in the hallway for a moment, looking at the house I'd bought in 1999. Before I met her, the house I'd put 32 years of weekends into, the house my son came home to from the hospital. And I knew exactly what I was going to do. I asked her to sit down. She started to say something about dinner. I said, "Sit down, please." She sat. I told her I knew. I told her about the bank statements. I told her about the transfers going back 11 months. I told her about the phone. I told her about the nighttime visits and what my father had told me that afternoon in the kitchen. I told her I had spoken to a lawyer. She didn't cry. I think I expected crying. Instead, she went very still, the way someone goes still when they're calculating, when they're deciding which version of events to offer. She started to say something about how difficult it had been, how much she'd given up, how she hadn't meant for it to, and I held up my hand. "I don't need you to explain it to me," I said. "I need you to leave." She left 2 days later. She took her car and her personal things and some items I later found out she was not entitled to take, which became part of the legal process. I changed the locks that same evening. I put my father's phone back on his nightstand with the charger plugged in. He called my son in Vancouver that night, and they spoke for an hour and a half. The legal matter is ongoing. The financial exploitation portion has been referred to the appropriate authorities. My lawyer has been clear with me that the process takes time. I have been patient. I can afford to be patient now that my father is safe. He is still here, in the room with the curtains my wife chose that I haven't had the heart to change because they're good curtains, and he says he likes them. He comes down for breakfast every morning now. He's been talking about whether there's room in the garage to set up a small workbench. His old woodworking tools are in storage in Barrie, and I've been thinking about driving up to get them. Last Saturday morning I made pancakes. I don't make them as well as he used to, not even close. He had a trick with the batter involving a bit of cornmeal that I've never quite replicated, but I made them, and he ate 3 of them, and he laughed at something I said about the hockey game the night before. His laugh. That loud, certain laugh. Still there. I am not someone who posts his private life on the internet. I want to be honest about that. This is not something I would have imagined myself doing a year ago. But the woman from the helpline said something to me that I keep coming back to. She said, "The hardest part about elder abuse, especially inside families, is that the people who could stop it often don't know it has a name. They think they're seeing a personality conflict, a difficult relationship, normal aging. They don't know what to look for. So if you're watching this because something in the title made you pause, if you have a parent living with someone else, or living with you, and something about the way they hold themselves lately doesn't match the person you've always known, I'm asking you to pay attention to that. Trust that feeling. It has a name, and there is help. Seniors Safety Line, 1-866-299-20111. In Canada, it's free, it's confidential, and they will help you understand what you're dealing with. My father deserved someone to pay attention. I'm glad, even now, that I finally did.